Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to ORF America. My name is Dhruva Jaishankar, Executive Director at ORF America, and thank you for joining us on this Monday afternoon, a few days before Prime Minister Modi of India is scheduled to arrive here in Washington for his first meeting under the new administration, the second administration of President Donald Trump. In light of this, we'll be having two panel discussions back-to-back today. The first one I have the pleasure of moderating, and I'll quickly introduce the participants. Just a reminder that this is on the record. This is being video recorded and will be broadcast in a day or two here. Really pleased and really thankful that we have three excellent panelists to join me today. Lindsey Ford, to my immediate right, was Senior Director for South Asia at the National Security Council in the Biden administration, prior to which she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for South and Southeast Asia. She previously worked at the Brookings Institution and the Asia Society Policy Institute, and prior to that worked at the Department of Defense from 2009 to 2015. Samir Lalwani, to her right, is a senior expert on South Asia at the U.S. Institute of Peace. From 2015 to 2022, Dr. Lalwani was Senior Fellow for Asia Strategy and Director of the South Asia Program at the Stimson Center. He was also a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the RAND Corporation and earned his doctorate from MIT. And last but not least, we have Walter Russell Mead, who is a Distinguished Fellow at the Hudson Institute and the Global View columnist at the Wall Street Journal. From 1997 to 2010, Mr. Mead was a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he's the author of several books, including, I believe most recently, The Ark of a Covenant, The United States, Israel, and the Fate of the Jewish People. So without further ado, I will start with Walter. It has been an eventful few weeks of the second Trump presidency on multiple fronts. You have been somebody who has followed President Trump for many years and followed U.S. foreign policy for many years, traveled with the president as well in his first term. What do you make of the first few weeks of the second Trump administration? What are its priorities, particularly in a global context? And what do you think the last few weeks indicate about what is in store for us for the next 4 years?
All right, well, it's great to be here. I should probably add that I'm also a professor now at the University of Florida and very eager to get back to Florida, where I understand the high today is 80 degrees and the state income tax is forecast to be 0. Look, this is, when Americans elect a president, we really elect a president. I mean, no one in history has commanded as large a share of the mind space of the human race as Donald Trump. And that was true during his first term as president. It was true in the 4 years between his two terms, and it is more true than ever today. And this is, you know, in a sense, Trump has a superpower of compelling attention by a mix of policy moves, rhetoric, positioning of himself. It's an extraordinary phenomenon. It's one that I think very few other leaders in the world can match. In terms of impact of the first few weeks, I think Trump has already been more disruptive in the first 3 weeks of his second term than perhaps he was in the whole 4 years of his first term. And that's partly because he's recapitulated, reissued executive orders and steps like withdrawing from the climate agreement and other things that took longer the first time around. And because he clearly has spent, he and the people around him spent a lot of time in the last 4 years thinking about what they would do if they got back in again. So, if we think about, you know, how this sort of torrential flood of energy is going to impact U.S.-India relations and what ideas President Trump is likely to bring to that relationship, I think there's several things we can see. The first is that in some ways, I think Prime Minister Modi is going to find Trump an easier counterpart to deal with than President Biden. A lot of people I meet in India tell me that Trump is, more popular in India than in the United States, and that India is a, quote, red state when it comes to American politics. There are a lot of people in India and a lot of different opinions, but there's no doubt that there is a kind of a strong current in Indian politics, which is perhaps stronger on the BJP side of the spectrum than on the Congress India side of the spectrum, that admires Trump and likes Trump and finds him an appealing figure for a whole range of reasons. That's going to make things easier. Another thing that's going to make things easier in the relationship is there will be less criticism from the United States about internal Indian policy, whether it's issues like Kashmir, treatment of minorities of various kinds, with the possible exception, by the way, of attacks on Christian churches or Christian communities, where there will be some voices on the Republican side raising questions. On the whole, there will be more of a disposition to look at the relationship simply through a strategic lens and through an economic lens. On the strategic lens, there'll probably be a lot of convergence. On the economic lens, it will be trickier, and that's where we may see a lot of action. Immigration could be another flashpoint. I see that at least one flight of deportees of Indian origin has landed in India. There may well be more. I haven't been following it closely, but that could cause a certain type of friction to develop. So finding ways to frame the immigration issue, finding ways to deal with trade. Reciprocity is Trump's favorite word when it comes to tariffs. I can tell you that it's not India's favorite word when it comes to tariffs, and that is going to, again, be very difficult for a coalition government in a parliamentary system to move perhaps as far and as fast as this administration would like. But that's probably enough of an overview. I'm sure some of the other panelists can add a lot of texture and maybe raise some different points than I did.
Thank you so much for the for setting the stage on that side. Lindsey, if I can turn to you, if you can just maybe bring us up to speed. This might be one of the first times you're speaking publicly after having left government. The first, okay, thank you. Well, we're privileged to have first statements there. But what do you believe, you were in the Biden administration for 4 years working on defense at the Pentagon and then a much broader array of strategic issues at the White House. What do you believe changed most in the India-U.S. defense and strategic relationships over the past 4 years that you worked on it? And what do you think are some of the developments that you think are less readily understood by those of us outside of government?
Yeah, thank you, Dhruva, and thanks for inviting me to have my first post-government offering of thoughts where I can give you my own thoughts and ones that are not dictated to me in my talking points. It's very liberating. So I would say this. If you had told me when I started in March of 21 where we were going to end up in the U.S.-India relationship by the time I left in January of 25, I don't think I would have believed you. And I'm somebody who was like a real optimist about this relationship. I think we inherited a strong hand. The India relationship, the U.S.-India relationship is one where I think there is more bipartisanship than there is in most relationships right now. And the Trump administration had done some good things the first time around, including elevating the Quad to a ministerial level, getting the foundational agreements done on defense. We were able, I think, to turbocharge the defense and technology cooperation in a way under the Biden administration, in a way that I think surprised a lot of folks, probably us on the inside too. If you look at things like the decision to transfer jet engine technology, U.S. companies putting significant hundreds of $millions of investments in collaboration in AI and semiconductors in India, a brand new national security advisor-led dialogue that was tackling everything from how we do R&D together on climate-resistant agriculture, on new university-to-university, lab-to-lab level tech collaboration. It was stunning, I think, the degree of cooperation that ramped up in a very short amount of time. And what I would say that I think was really a shift in how we approach the relationship is, one, you have two mammoth bureaucracies who, frankly, senior bureaucrats on both sides spend as much time doing hand-to-hand combat in your own bureaucracy as you do navigating the relationship between the two countries. And both sides made a really intentional choice that on key national security and technology areas, we were going to drive it from the top down. And by centralizing some things, I think it allowed us to move more quickly on realizing the ambition of certain defense co-production agreements or how we were going to work together on frontier technologies. Second, we were very intentional about bringing the private sector into the conversation. Now, oftentimes that has not been the way that the US government approaches its bilateral relationships, but we were very clear in saying to industry, what are your problems? How can we help break them down? We want to have that conversation. We're not trying to keep you at an arm's length, but also sending a very clear demand signal to industry. These are the areas that we are interested in working together. So it gave some degree of, I think, clear expectations around investments that folks needed. By doing those things together, I think it allowed ISET to get off the ground and become a real kind of thing. It also, I think, allowed us to find complementarity in the relationship, whether it is Indian engineers together with large US corporations and manufacturing that made the sum of the parts stronger than the individual whole. And in many ways, I think, made this partnership one that, although it's not an alliance, is working as closely and in some areas in more advanced areas of technology cooperation than the US is doing with some of its allies, which I don't think is widely understood.
Interesting. No, thanks for bringing us up to speed. And I think sometimes the private sector element, I think you're right, is not often well appreciated outside of the U.S. and Indian governments, which allows me to segue to Samir. You follow the U.S.-India defense relationship and the strategic relationship quite closely. We hear a lot of acronyms being batted about. Lindsey just explained what ISET was, National Security Advisor-led. We also hear about INDOSEX, something you've been involved with as well. Can you just maybe explain to the audience what is the intent behind some of these initiatives, and how do you think they've fared so far? And before we turn to sort of where they can go.
Push the button. All right. Well, thanks, Dhruva, for inviting me. It's a privilege to be here. And I'll pick up where Lindsey left off, because I think what I can see from my vantage point is sort of, I may have less specifics, but I think I was noticing an architecture that was being built over the last 4 years in this defense technology cooperation. So I think there were 3 elements of it that we were observing. So one is, as she said, directing this to industry. This was a clear market signal. And so not everything seemed to be having to run through government, but there was an encouragement for investment, for industrial partnerships, for teaming efforts that the private sector seemed to be picking up. And so you saw this pace of growth in activity Some of it that was sort of directly being enabled by government, by sort of the regulators and sort of supporting export control sort of agreements or licensing. But some of it was just happening organically. And I was sometimes pleasantly surprised to discover relationships that have been formed that even government didn't know about, but were good to take credit for because ultimately they were part of this broader sort of market trend that I think the U.S. and Indian governments had together tried to set. So that I think was really, really constructive. You saw this in semiconductors. You saw this in space. I mean, I think U.S. cooperation with Indian commercial space is growing and sort of, is going to continue to grow. A lot of Indian space companies are working already with SpaceX on launch. Their payloads sort of go on Falcon 9. So there's a lot of collaboration that was already existing, and this kind of, as Lindsey said, turbocharged it. I think the second part, though, I mean, the sort of the INDUS-X acronym, we have to break down these acronyms. It's the India-U.S. Defense Accelerator Ecosystem. X just sounds cool. But I think, you need both the accelerator part and the ecosystem part, right? So basically, an accelerator is about networking capital, innovation, some sort of engineering and business inputs all together, and that's, you see a lot of companies sort of growing in sort of these accelerator environments, but you need an ecosystem because you need a lot of these players to get to know each other and partner with each other that wasn't normally happening. I mean, like defense is a really stunted market environment, right? And dual use environments are highly regulated. There's not just a natural flow of private enterprise where you would in other sectors like we're seeing like in IT or IT services or something like that. And so you needed fostering of it actively by entities that had the ability to, encourage and support and even troubleshoot at times. And so I saw this network being built. You see young startups coming in from India and the United States. They were looking to vertically partner with their own OEMs and sort of defense majors in their countries, but then also cross-pollinate. They were looking to find sources of venture capital or even government funding sources, whether it's challenges, whether it's the equivalent of SIBRs. They were looking for technology partners, so R&D institutions, whether it was labs for testing or R&D sort of prototyping that they can commercialize. And then they needed to work with the policy community to understand how these technologies could sort of make their way into a government contract, an acquisition, but also be useful for the warfighter. At the end of the day, I think the strength of this effort over the last few years has been trying to tether the technology relationship to a particular end that's, a particular mission and function, which is deterrence, right? Deterrence of adversaries, deterrence of coercion that both the United States and India were facing. And so I think that through line was really helpful, and the networking sort of part of it complemented that. And then the third part, it seemed to me, was that there was an effort to lower the regulatory sill. And that was as much about actually having changes in interpretation of export controls, expediting decisions for licensing or technology assistance agreements, but also changing industry perceptions of it, right? Because at some level, if industry doesn't believe this has happened, they're not going to submit those license applications. They're not going to submit those TAAs, and that sort of has a chilling effect on the kinds of collaboration that I think government was trying to stimulate. So it's not just about changing the practice, but also kind of making it visible to more parties and players. And so I think that made a lot of progress on the defense technology side. You can see it. There's measurable impacts in terms of the number of industrial collaborations that we're seeing. And a colleague at Vikram and I tried to track this in a little data set. But then the counterpart to this is not just about industry partnerships. It's also about what deterrent effects are we creating. And what I thought was really interesting is that in the last few years, we've been tracking what we can from the open source about defense exercises. You were seeing sort of a secular trend of growth in defense exercise between the U.S. and India, more complex exercises, higher quality, larger number of assets, a greater quantity of them. And so that, to me, signaled that these two things were working in tandem, that a technology relationship was widening the scope of the deterrence and operational relationship between the U.S. and India.
I'll just also say that the first time I had to explain to the Secretary of Defense what INDUS-X stood for, and he said, "What's the X?" my answer was also basically, it just sounds cool.
A quick clarification, just again, because people who followed so a lot of people who followed the India-U.S. defense relationship for a long time, there was a sense of, I would say, a mild degree of frustration. There were a lot of sales. Increasingly, India, I think, has purchased 7, 8 major platforms from the U.S. over the past 15, 20 years. But there was, a couple of initiatives. One was something called DTTI, Defense Trade and Technology Initiative. Maybe either Samir or Lindsey, if you want to have what became of it and how is Indus-X different. And secondly, if you can give the significance of the major defense partnership as well, maybe Lindsey, for you, this was something the Obama administration started moving. What makes India a major defense partner?
Sure. So when I started in March of 21, I heard a lot about DTTI, and uniformly, whether it was an American interlocutor or an Indian interlocutor, it wasn't positive. Nothing that anyone was saying to me about DTTI was, gee, we had this big thing and it's so great. What I uniformly was hearing was, we have had this big vision for so long that the United States and India were going to work together on defense technology cooperation. Here's all the ways in the last decade that it has not actually lived up to our ambitions. That is a large part of what the impetus was for creating something like Indus-X, because I think there was an understanding that we had to show tangible progress on defense technology cooperation, and it needed to happen quickly. Or frankly, industry on both sides was not going to believe in the value proposition anymore. So that is partially why, rather than going after, the biggest, shiniest things, like say aircraft carriers, we intentionally talked to industry and said, what are the areas where we think there is a business case, but there is also an operational need, and we know that militaries on both sides would be interested. I think, candidly, as that model ramped up, more of our cooperation flowed there than it did to DTTI, and as often happens, you shift toward one sort of venue over another. So I think we have found a model now that is much more operationally and industry-driven in a way that produces results more quickly. To your question about the major defense partnership, look, the major defense partnership was not just something that the Trump administration had in mind, it was something that Congress had in mind. And it really was a more fundamental, without India being a treaty ally in the way that we have, alliances with Japan, with European partners, how do we make this defense partnership have some of the actual attributes of an alliance in the same way? And so creating the major defense partnership gives India, faster access, approvals on technology, essentially says when we look at tech transfer, operational cooperation, all these things, we will treat India in the same way that we would an ally. That's really challenging to actually make happen on a day-to-day basis, but I think having that demand signal there allows us, when we're thinking about the transfer of specific technologies, to say there is a clear signal that says we should lean toward yes rather than no when it comes to India.
Thanks. I have a second set of questions for all three of you before turning to the audience. And I wanted, we've talked about sort of setting the stage in some ways. Where are we now with the Trump administration and India-U.S. Strategic relations? But maybe I can start with Walter. You just came back from a trip to India not that long ago. You went all over. Can I ask you, where do you see two things? One, what do you think are some of the big misconceptions a lot of people here in Washington have about India? What are some of them? And two, what do you see as some of the most potent areas of opportunity in the next 4 years?
All right. Well,
we need a microphone for the recording.
I'm used to having such a loud voice. I don't worry about the mics, but India is a country that's very hard for Americans to understand. It's hard for anybody to understand, including many Indians, I must say. But it is, Americans, when we travel to another country, we're used to traveling to a place that is less complex than the society that we're coming from. So that if an American were to go to Egypt, our economy is more diversified than Egypt's. Our ethnic and religious mixes are more complex than Egypt's. Our history isn't as long as Egypt's, but American society today has a lot going on not saying that Egypt doesn't have a lot going on, but it's kind of intellectually a little clearer. For an American in India, you have to realize this is a society that's actually geographically, culturally, historically, economically either as diverse or several times more diverse than we are. And so we really find ourselves, I think, often thrown off balance as we try to figure out just what it is that we're dealing with. I suppose the thing that hits me the most on travel to India and speaking with people in various walks of life there is the thing that Americans perhaps have the hardest time understanding is the importance of geography to India, of Indian geography to India. We tend to, for example, to divide the world between the Middle East and South Asia with this clear, bright line that has perhaps Iran on one side of it and Pakistan on the other. Nobody in India sees that line, at least not in that way. Or we might see a world where that we think of the South Asian region as relatively quiet. If you're in India and you look at Bangladesh, you look at Pakistan, you look at Sri Lanka, you don't feel like you're living in a safe, calm part of the world. And of course, you have China right to your north. I think this leads us not only to sometimes misunderstand irritants from the Indian standpoint in the relationship, where we just sort of don't pay attention to something that to many Indians will seem very important and very obvious. Like, for example, the strategic importance of Bangladesh to India's ability to defend its northeastern states from any potential attack. But also, we miss opportunities for partnership. India sees itself as much more closely aligned or engaged in the Middle East than the average American, even the average American foreign policy expert would understand. I believe there are more people of Indian origin living in the UAE than there are citizens of the United Arab Emirates. And this is not some new phenomenon of 21st century globalization. The trade between India and the Middle East for millennia has actually, in many ways, been culturally and economically more important than the Silk Road, the famous Silk Road to the north. India is and increasingly will be a major force in the Middle East. In general, India's interests in the Middle East tend to align pretty closely with those of the United States. Not exactly, but closely. This offers all kinds of opportunities. We've been talking a lot about the tech relationship, and there's a lot of interest in India in deepening relations with Israel, with the UAE, with the United States as some kind of a tech corridor or group of privileged partners, something that from an American point of view might give all of these countries more reason to engage with each other and less interest in possibly engaging with China on some of these tech issues. So there are lots of ways, and India, by the way, would really like a stable Middle East that didn't have a lot of wars that caused irregularities in oil and gas supply. As time goes on, India as both a destination for oil and a customer of oil, a place for investment, source of workers and experts, and geopolitical partner is likely to grow throughout the Middle East. So there are ways, I think, that the United States can benefit by thinking about the world from the perspective of New Delhi and seeing how this helps us reshape some of our concepts about what is and isn't possible in regions of great interest to us.
That's great. It's interesting how in the Middle East, sometimes it is a sort of top-down thing, but I found people here were quite surprised when I2U2 was announced, this grouping of India, Israel, the United Arab Emirates and the United States, and then even more so when IMEC, the India Middle East Europe corridor, was announced in September of 2023. It gets to how sometimes these mental maps matter. And it's perhaps another example of how there's been a buildup from Trump to Biden back to Trump, which is the Abraham Accords under the Trump administration, I2U2 and under the Biden administration, and then leading to, again, let's see if there's going to be a buildup there. If I can turn maybe to Lindsey next. You've talked about, a lot of the progress that has been made in the last 4 years, but can you speak maybe to some of the challenges you see? You mentioned already the bureaucratic challenges, but what are some of the continuing challenges for India-US strategic cooperation, and where would you like to see some improvements in the years ahead?
Sure. Two things that I think I would highlight. One, when it came to initiatives like ISET, Initiative on Critical Emerging Technologies, the logic was very clear that where we wanted to center the relationship was, let's look at sectors and technologies where there is both a clear commercial and economic case, but there is also a very clear national security nexus. And that was kind of going to be the sweet spot. What that means, though, is that, as Samir said, these tend to be highly regulated sectors on both sides. Part of the ISET initiative was hearing from industry and identifying ways that you could knock down some of those regulations. What I would say is that thus far, that is still an incredibly labor-intensive effort. It requires senior bureaucrats on both sides going down in the weeds on very technical things that could involve individual licenses for single companies. That's not sustainable on a permanent basis. And what that means is that both the Indian and the US governments are gonna need to look at some more kind of sector-specific and more transformative changes that they want to make that will not be easy around, on the US side, loosening tech transfer rules in certain sectors. The Biden administration did this right as we left, making some decisions around civil nuclear cooperation, delisting of some Indian entities, along with changes to our MTCR rules that would enable greater space cooperation. There are more choices like that that are going to have to be made. On the Indian side, it's going to require, on export controls and on tech security, better aligning with where the United States is if you want US companies and the US government to put India into sort of like the top tier of countries that we work with. That's not going to be easy, but it is hugely important. The second that I would say on the defense side, tech transfer, defense industry cooperation, it's wonderful. But at the end of the day, if your militaries are not actually training on how they use those technologies, there's not a whole lot of point to it on the defense side, because as Samir said, it's ultimately about getting the technology in the hands of the warfighter. The US and India have done a lot to advance our military training and exercises, but there is a lot more that still needs to be done, in particularly looking at jointness, how you bring services together, but also in space, in cyberspace and AI, how we will integrate those technologies into our training and exercises. So those, I think, are going to be real challenges that we'll have to continue to address.
Finally, before we turn to the audience, Samir, where and how would you like to see progress in the India-US defense and strategic relationship over the next 4 years? And maybe could you identify sort of 2 or 3 major developments that you would most like to see?
Okay, so my colleague Vikram Singh and I have an article coming out, hopefully the next couple days, that will give you like a long laundry list of this, but let me give you like some highlights. Look, in general, I think we know what the effects we want are. We want to see more industry-to-industry partnerships, teaming, business flow happening between both countries, technology development, iterations. And so all the processes that are in place to get that started, we'd like to see that sort of scaled up 10x. We'd like to similarly see the level of operational cooperation scaled up at the same pace. So all the things that Lindsey talked about, we should be issuing joint challenges and RFPs together for capabilities that we would then potentially use together, right? So linking those streams and scaling them. But there's something actually sort of more specific I can give right now, which is, the U.S. and India are going to be renewing a bilateral defense framework this year. We've had one for 10 years. It's up for renewal. It'll set the course for the next 10 years. And there's a couple things that we've been thinking about that I think could really be helpful. One of them is there was this great innovation in the previous Trump administration of the 2+2 dialogue. And I think it became a 2+2 ministerial. And it seemed to be really effective, so much so that the Biden administration continued with it and built upon it. And it became a really effective vehicle for closing decision loops, right? We have different processes between our ministries of defense and our ministries of state, foreign affairs, external affairs. And so this was a way to synchronize sort of the political and the mill together. And it seemed to work really well. I think we need to inject that framework, the 2+2 sort of concept, within the bilateral defense framework. Because there's a ton of bilateral defense engagements, military cooperation group, executive steering groups, joint technical groups, all that are doing bilateral engagements, but not necessarily infused with the sensibilities of politics. I mean, politics not in the party politics sense, but an understanding of the sort of political strategic ends of these. And I think to infuse that with politics means sort of bringing in the ministries of external affairs and the State Department into these conversations, not necessarily to dominate them, but to sort of bring that extra sensibility into those discussions. I think that could really turbocharge the effectiveness of each of these bilateral agreements. Similarly, I would say, just as you have the most effective sort of methods of innovation we found are that you have engineers teamed with sort of the end user or the warfighter to iterate over time and sort of to continuously make improvements in development. So you're not just trying to sort of have this final grand product that's engineered in a silo and then put out into the wild, but you're constantly improving it. I think similarly, it'd be really useful for our technologists, for whether it's sort of DIU or IDEX or other sort of parts of our defense technology ecosystem, to be embedded in all these conversations. Again, potentially as a listener, but potentially as a way in which to learn from what's going on the strategic political side, and then work backwards from there. Okay, so our militaries are seeing this kind of threat assessment, this kind of problem. What can we do sort of to inject within our joint challenges or our accelerator programs some level of requirements or collaboration that will address that? And I think that sort of constant re-engineering will be another really useful element to the defense relationship.
Yeah, I think actually the Indian Defense Minister Rajnath Singh spoke with Pete Hegseth, I think just a few days after he was confirmed. And one of the things I noticed in the readout was they talked about renewing the 10-year framework agreement sometime this year. I think it's time. We have about 20 minutes for Q&A, so maybe we'll take 2 or 3 from the floor, maybe the 2 up here first, and back. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. My name is Aruna Yagari. I'm the policy analyst at the TV9 USA. The question I have is, clearly the current administration is not inclined towards multilateralism. So my question is on Indo-Pacific. So we all aspire, I hope we do, for a free and open Indo-Pacific. With the current lack of focus on multilateralism, would this embolden any regional rogue players in the area, if any, in the area of Indo-Pacific, and how should US or India look at that?
Maybe up here in the front. If you could thank you.
Thank you for mentioning, my name is Atik Pandyala. Thank you for mentioning a lot of the US-India defense cooperation and the ecosystem that has been built, such as sharing underwater subsurface stuff or even AI cooperation. But there seems to be a few keystone issues of US-India defense cooperation that have hit a few snags in the last few years. Most notably is the GE engine delays that have been affecting the Tejas fighter program, but also US-India defense deals have also attracted new scrutiny, especially within India, such as the Stryker armored vehicle program. For the Trump administration to really navigate the pressures of Indian self-reliance, but also concerns about US reliability, what can the Trump administration do to actually affect these concerns? And do they clash with the administration's own priorities of increasing US defense sales to India?
Maybe we can take one more question. Maybe, sorry, person up there had their hand first.
Yeah, so I'm curious.
You could introduce yourself as well.
Yes, my name is Prab. So the 5th generation planes, that's one of my things I want to talk about. As you know, China is offering something to Pakistan, J-35. And India's option is Su-57. Where do you think, is there any options out there for India and Lockheed, that's developing a lot of the fifth generation for US to have some partnership? And also cruisers, India doesn't have any cruisers, which is a big warfare kind of a battleship. I think 6 countries have them, India doesn't have them. US has 9. I mean, what do you think? Is there going to be something on that level as well?
Okay. Maybe, well, if you could take the question of multilateralism in the Indo-Pacific, perhaps, and then for you on the other questions.
Well, I think the Indo-Pacific is an interesting area for multilateralism because cooperation like the Quad is sort of institution light compared to, say, NATO or other things, and that seems to be the way everyone in the Quad likes it. So I think in a certain way that's kind of multilateralism is easier for someone like President Trump to feel comfortable with, as opposed to sort of rule-driven bureaucratic institutions that he feels act as a constraint on American power. So I think the multilateral issues, except in terms of trade, where many countries in the Indo-Pacific have very strong views about the importance of anchoring trade relations in rule-driven institutions, I think it will be less of an issue on the defense side.
Do you want to take a question on?
Sure. Okay, so I guess let me start with the, how the question about delivery delays and things like this. I would say 2 things there. One, look, there definitely were challenges in the post-COVID environment, not just with any one defense company, but with many of them, to ensure that deliveries and things were happening on schedule, because supply chains were completely snarled. This is one reason why I think the SOSA, the security of supply arrangement that the Biden administration concluded with the Modi administration, but also the conversations that we agreed to on reciprocal defense procurement, which would allow greater sort of supply chain integration between our industrial bases, are so important. That will help not just in one instance, but across the board. I would say, however, I've seen a lot of stories about, say, the GE 404 delays. I've seen very few stories about the numerous delays across the Russian defense industrial base of their deliveries to India. So I think if we want to talk about delays, that is just fine. But we ought to do that in an even-handed way that does not suggest that just one company or only one country is having delays, because that's just a really, frankly, biased way to have the conversation. So I'm sorry, that's a bit of a bugaboo for me. Now that I'm not in government, I can say that more directly. On Stryker, look, there are some things like Stryker, Javelin, like GE engines that the United States has made available from a tech transfer standpoint, that would be game-changing for India, and that India would be the first overseas producer. That's in addition to the stuff with Lockheed, with Boeing, that's already on the table, that is really fantastic opportunities to build up India's own manufacturing base. So there will certainly be a lot of conversations that need to happen still at a G2G level for how that stuff stays on track and on time. But these are really, I think, significant technology offers that the United States is making available, and they would be quite transformative in the defense relationship. Could that ever extend to 5th gen? Maybe, right? That's a question for the future. I would say this without presupposing anything. When you look at where the United States has agreed to release technologies like the F-35s, there's some pretty common threads across those countries in terms of who they do and don't have defense relationships with, what their tech security practices look like, that I would presume you would have to address in any country were the US Defense Department to decide to release that technology. That would be true for India as for anywhere else.
I think think Aero India is on right now, as I believe, as well, right? So you
Can
want
I
to take
jump
that?
in on that last question as well? Because there are three things on the question of who can India go to for a fifth generation fighter. So one, wouldn't be so certain about this J-35 report that the Chinese are just giving this to Pakistan. I think we should have a degree of, I wouldn't say skepticism, but like let's just sort of take some realities into account about sort of Pakistan's finances, and sort of how China's historically behaved with Pakistan. I mean, I don't discount it, but I think that we're not talking about this being an imminent problem. The second thing, though, I think is more important, because you're saying, look, India needs a fifth generation option. It needs a cruiser to match sort of like Chinese cruisers. I think that you're getting trapped in this problem of symmetry, of sort of like mirror imaging. And actually, I think India can leapfrog or sidestep some of these problems if it's a little more creative and sort of like leverages asymmetry. So rather than asking the question of like, what is our fifth generation fighter, I'd be asking the question of like, what are our missile capabilities? What are our rocket artillery capabilities? And how can we improve those? Maybe find partners who are also dealing with similar problems of, sort of long range fires, precision fires. Maybe we can partner with them on some of those areas. So how can we leverage UASs to offset some of these things? And then the third part, piggybacking off of what Lindsey said about, there's been some delivery delays on the Russian side. I mean, I still haven't seen all 5 of those S-400 battalions, but maybe this is a good opportunity to rethink those, because there was some demonstrations of performance or lack of performance, both in the Russia-Ukraine theater, but also in the Israel-Iran theater. The performance of the S-300 was not that great. The performance of Israeli air defense systems looked a lot better. Those Israeli systems are built upon or integrated with U.S. systems, and so I think the combination of the U.S. and Israel offers an alternative that maybe India, if it's really concerned about sort of the air disadvantage that's facing against China, the PLAF, or the Pakistani Air Force, maybe it should be looking at sort of what offsets that. And I think going back to whether it's PAC-3 or THAAD or David Sling or Arrow, those are all things that I think India could put back on the table with the same justification. These systems haven't arrived, and their performance is spotty thus far.
Maybe one more round of questions. So Sarang in the front. If you could just wait for the microphone, please. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, Sarang Shidore, Quincy Institute. Question for Samir and maybe Lindsey as well. On the foundational agreements, that was such a major breakthrough between the US and India. You had COMCASA, you had BECA, you had the logistics one prior to that. Looking back, what is the scorecard of those foundational agreements achieving the kind of jointness that you have talked about, that more needs to be done? But have they created a qualitative shift in jointness since 2018 or so to until now? It's been 6 or 7 years. Thanks.
In the front, if you just pass the microphone. Go ahead, and then Iskander after that.
Seema Sirohi, I'm a columnist for the Economic Times, an Indian newspaper. I have a question for Walter. If you're an outsider trying to understand what's going on in Washington today, all the breakdowns, all the Doge and this and that, and the President Trump's attempt to sort of change geographies, acquire Gaza Strip to rebuild as if it were a redevelopment project, etc., etc. How should you understand it? Is it for real, or is it all a negotiating tactic? My question to Lindsey, now that you're out of government, maybe you could tell us that now that USAID has been sort of disbanded, to use a polite word, there's been some former official who has said how the agency used money for various projects in Bangladesh to undermine the government of Sheikh Hasina, including funding rap artists and NGOs and fringe groups that really weren't part of the political system, quote unquote.
If you could pass it down here. Yeah.
Thank you. Iskander Raymond at the RAND Corporation. I hope the panelists will forgive me, but I thought I might drop a bit of a turd in the punch bowl, because I thought that might make things a little bit more interesting. I think that everyone in this room is is stalwartly invested in the India-US relationship and understands its strategic rationale. But I think that in the past few years, we've also seen some revealing differences highlighted in between both partners when it comes to their worldview and certain residual tensions. And so I was just going to briefly evoke three and see who would want to tackle them. And maybe just highlight how both partners can best work together to overcome these residual tensions. So the first, of course, is differences and mutual frustrations over the war in Ukraine. The second is frictions in between intelligence agencies when it comes to members of the Indian diaspora, including those residing in the United States, and certain assassination plots. And the third is tensions over immigration and the H-1B visa issue, which is obviously going to come to the fore in a more pronounced way under this administration. Thank you. And I apologize once again.
Last question.
Tanvi Milan from Brookings. One question for Professor Russell Mead and then one just for the panel. China, on which you have written considerably, and how that's been a driver of US-India relations. There's been strategic convergence, which all of that has been made possible, especially on the defense and security side. Huge assist from Xi Jinping. There have been mixed signals in the first few weeks of this administration about the potential direction of China policy in this administration. Where do you think China policy might go over the next few years? And then just for everybody to flip Dhruva's question, what do you think in the last few years of your travels to India or speaking to others, what do you think the biggest misconceptions Indians have about the US?
Okay, we'll do the last round of questions. Maybe start with Walter. So I think I had a question on Doge and what's going on there, China policy, and where will the US be on China policy and misconceptions about Indians have about the US.
Well, Doge, China, and Indian misconceptions about the US. Three simple topics that can be very, very easily addressed. I mean, on the India misconceptions, I'll just say one that I keep seeing, which is so many Indians on an individual basis think that if they meet an American who seems at all well-connected, this person could help them resolve a visa issue. And sadly, it's not true. But India is not the only country that has this set of misconceptions, but that bureaucracy is resistant to phone calls, even from old college roommates or whatever it might be. On Trump and trying to understand this sort of big thing that he's doing, I would say the best place to start remains to study the life and career of President Andrew Jackson. I've written an essay on the Jacksonian tradition in American foreign politics, foreign affairs. But if you think about the Andrew Jackson, our seventh president, he broke the federal civil service and created essentially a spoil system in the government in order to mobilize support for his political party. He broke the second bank of the United States, then functioning as our de facto central bank, in a way that's a bit reminiscent of support for cryptocurrencies and so on today. And it brought in a kind of a governance, a hostility to elites, and both an economic and a social populism that both for good and the bad sought to bring the sort of social attitudes and common sense reasoning of the average American into the corridors of power. And I think, and had a very enduring impact on American politics. I think that's a good way to start. Jackson was also a territorial expansionist, was a chief promoter of the annexation of Texas. So in a lot of these ways, you can really see President Trump, who has hung Andrew Jackson's portrait in the Oval Office in both presidencies, as following a sort of tradition. So I would start with that as a way to begin to try to understand what's going on. On China policy, it's going to be very interesting because the forces that drive, there are a lot of very strong forces in both China and the United States that would lead us to try to find some sort of mutual understanding and accommodation. In fact, it makes infinitely more sense that we find a way to live together than that we go into some prolonged, expensive, and perhaps terminally dangerous conflict. So World War III just seems like such a bad option. And yet, at the same time, there are differences of interest that keep and differences of perception that keep driving us apart. And Donald Trump has his political constituencies and his loyalties. President Xi Jinping also has, just because you're a one-party state with authoritarian rule doesn't mean you don't have politics and that you don't have to worry about opinion, both elite and popular. So I think there's both on the U.S. and the Chinese side at any given moment, you're going to find forces pushing toward a confrontation and forces pushing away. How those get resolved is not entirely up to either country. And there are, I think, some structural forces in international relations. But when I try to help Americans understand at least a bit about the U.S.-China relationship, I say one way to understand our problem is that in 1980, India's GDP was about 67% of China's GDP. Today, India's GDP is about 17% of China's. That gap is basically the sort of origin of the balance of power problem in Asia today. That if India were operating as on a similar economic level to China, if India had developed over the last 30 years, not even at China's pace, but simply staying in the same realm that it had once been, China would have far less ambitious plans for Asia, because it would see that the Indo-Pacific is too big for any country, including China, rationally to aspire to control. And for me, that's really a foundation of the relationship between the United States and India. That this is not actually so much about military cooperation or alignment, to get to some of your turd in the punch bowl points on different smaller issues. It's a big way in which Indian prosperity, India's growth, actually helps ameliorate America's biggest foreign policy challenge and increases the chance for the peaceful evolution of the Indo-Pacific region, which may be the most important goal facing the human race in the 21st century.
If I can turn to maybe last answers, maybe Samir, if you could address the operational question on the foundational agreements and the operations, and maybe if you could talk about the differences in Bangladesh. So, Samir.
Cool, I got the easy one. On foundational agreements, look, I mean, I think the other term that I used to hear them described as is enabling agreements, and that I think is helpful for us to appreciate that this is it's a floor or sort of like a permission structure, but not a guarantee that we utilize these or utilize them frequently. And I think that is the next step, which is sort of the reps and sets of utilizing and exercising the lease agreements or the sort of the reciprocal sort of access agreements or reciprocal supply agreements. So, underway replenishments, doing more of those, doing more landing P8s in each other's sort of bases to refuel and move on, doing more ship repair. Those are the kinds of things I think we need to see more frequency of to sort of be confident that they are building out those muscles. But just the signatures alone, I think, were not sufficient. I think that was often, you can say as a misconceptualization. I think that was a misunderstanding maybe not necessarily in New Delhi or in like South Block, but a misunderstanding amongst sort of the strategic community that those signatures alone were doing the work of deterrence, and they clearly were not.
Okay. So, Seema, let me take this question, and I'm actually going to flow it into the two last questions here. Look, U.S. aid has funded for decades, civil society groups and public actors in countries around the world. And the intent of that has always been to enable more space for civil society. So while I don't intend to debate, specific tiny little grants that people are looking at, what I would say is I think it points to two more fundamental questions maybe about US policy in South Asia and toward Bangladesh. One, was US policy intended in any way to undermine or take out the Hasina government? Absolutely not. No, it was not US policy. And that, in many cases, that would never be true, but in this specific instance, the United States worked with the Hasina government, coordinated with the Indian government on how we thought about South Asia policy in the same way that the United States is now talking to the interim government as well. So the ultimate aim is that Bangladesh was going to be a successful, stable, thriving democracy, not anything that was about one specific leader of that country. Second, I think the sort of notion that was out there that perhaps even Sheikh Hasina has talked about at times, that this was intentional because it was somehow retribution, just not true. It just wasn't US policy either to attempt to weaken India by weakening the government in Bangladesh, or to put our thumb on the scale about who the leadership of Bangladesh was. That is and always has been up to the Bangladeshi people, and that has always been the position of the US government. Which I guess leads me into the two questions over here. Certainly, in the last year, the issue of Bangladesh was a friction point in the US-India relationship, in the same way that when Prime Minister Modi went to Moscow during the NATO summit, that was a point of friction, in the same way that indictments or decisions about specific technologies have been points of friction. This is a complicated relationship between two of the largest democracies in the world that have shared interests across any number of issues, and those are just issues we're going to have to continue to work and navigate together. And what I would tell you is that behind the scenes, whether it was Bangladesh, Russia, Ukraine, issues with the Department of Justice, we are at a point in this relationship where it is strong and mature enough where we can talk about those issues candidly together and we can work through them, which is why this partnership has continued to strengthen across administrations, which I guess brings me to Tanvi's question, what is it that I wish more Indians understood? The notion that I have heard sometimes that the United States seeks to weaken India is just nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. Across administrations, the US government has made decisions to intentionally enable and hasten India's rise as a global player very intentionally, whether that is bringing India into certain international groupings, advocating for India to have a permanent seat at the United Nations, approving transfers of specific technologies. None of those are just things that happened. The US government made those choices, and I expect will continue to, because we believe that a strong and prosperous India that is in partnership with the United States is good for us and it's good for the world.
Thank you. I'm going to end on three notes quickly. First, I would be remiss if I did not plug a number of our publications and our work at ORF America, and you can find a lot of literature and propaganda in the back of the room on lots of issues, from US-India tech and defense cooperation to coordination of foreign assistance, and any number of other topics, including some of the issues we discussed, like India and the Middle East and such. So please avail of all of that. Secondly, we are going to do a very quick scene change, so please stay in your seats. We'll have the next panel coming up immediately after this to discuss business and economic relations between the US and India for the next hour. And finally, please join me in thanking our great panel for a very candid and wide-ranging talk.